The morning sky above Western Europe looked deceptively calm, painted in strokes of pale blue and drifting clouds. From the cockpits of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, German pilots grinned with the easy arrogance of men who believed the war belonged to them. To their eyes, the lumbering silhouettes approaching from the west were nothing more than flying barns, slow, overweight machines, stitched together from bolts and bravado. They called it the Flying Fortress, but inside Luftwaffe ready rooms, the name was muttered with smirks, as if the Americans had mistaken wishful thinking for engineering. Shift the frame closer, and you'd see the smoke curling from cigarettes between gloved fingers, the laughter echoing across hangars as pilots bet bottles of schnapps on how many fortresses would fall that day. The war diary entries dripped with casual confidence. Another easy hunt. They bring us these clumsy birds, we pluck them from the sky. To the Luftwaffe, the B-17 wasn't a fortress. It was a target practice exercise with engines. But lean in closer still, into the vibrating belly of one of those bombers, and the picture changes. You'd hear the steady metallic heartbeat of 4 Wright Cyclone engines, each pistoning through the sky with mechanical determination. You'd feel the shiver of .50 caliber machine guns locked into their turrets, 6 men swiveling behind glass domes like chess pieces ready to strike. And in the cramped space between steel and sky, you'd sense something the German pilots had fatally underestimated. Discipline, coordination, and a nation's manufacturing muscle poured into rivets and armor plate. The irony? While German aces mocked the fortress for being slow, its very slowness meant stability in tight box formations. While they dismissed its defensive guns as scattered fireworks, those guns could stitch the air with lethal geometry, turning the sky into a trap. And while they sneered at its payload, the bombs falling from its bays would, in time, erase the very airfields where that laughter once rang out. I believe this is the paradox of arrogance. The louder the laughter, the quieter the listening. The Luftwaffe heard only the clumsy engines, but they failed to hear the drumbeat of inevitability inside them. The Flying Fortress did not need to be elegant, it only needed to be relentless. And that is why today in this story, we will walk through the clash between ridicule and reality. We'll trace the diary entries, the survivor testimonies, the technical brilliance hidden beneath that bulky frame. You'll discover why the B-17, mocked as a flying joke, rewrote the map of Germany one crater at a time. So, if you've ever wondered how a machine that looked like a lumbering beast managed to crush the pride of Europe's most feared air force, stay with us. Because by the end of this journey, you won't just understand the fortress, you'll feel the tremor of its engines in your bones. And before we dive in, don't forget, subscribe to this channel for more cinematic deep dives into the machines, the battles, and the human arrogance that changed history. This isn't just a story of steel, it's a story of hubris meeting reality, and reality always wins. The war in the skies did not begin with firestorms over Berlin, nor with the blackened ruins of Hamburg. It began with something quieter, almost tentative, yet heavy with consequence. August 17, 1942, the U.S. 8th Air Force, still green, launched its first B-17 daylight raid against the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen in occupied France. To most German officers, it was a curiosity, an experiment doomed to fail. They had grown used to British bombers creeping in under the cover of night, scattering their payloads with imprecise haste. The notion that Americans would brazenly march across daylight skies, in slow, bulky machines and expect to survive, it was, in their eyes, a joke written in aluminum. From the control towers, Luftwaffe spotters described the first wave with detached amusement. Like elephants on parade, one officer noted in his diary. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were scrambled with casual confidence. The young pilots were eager. Here was sport, a chance to tally easy kills against naive Americans. But when they reached the bombers, expectation collided with reality. Instead of straggling targets, the B-17s flew in disciplined box formations. Their wings overlapped with mathematical precision. From every angle, interlocking arcs of .50 caliber machine gun fire awaited. A pilot diving from the rear would find himself in the cone of the tail gunner and the dorsal turret. Approaching from the side meant crossing streams of fire from waist gunners. And from above, the top turret rotated with unnerving speed, spitting fire into the path of the attackers. One German fighter ace, Karl-Heinz Schumann, would later remark, "It was like flying into a saw blade. We expected clumsy giants." What we found were porcupines of steel. His Messerschmitt limped back to base that day, riddled with holes, its paint scorched by near misses. The Rouen raid itself was small in scale, just a handful of bombers escorted by Spitfires, but it sent a quiet shiver through Luftwaffe command. The yards were hit with precision, not scattered devastation but deliberate strikes on switches, engines and rolling stock. For the first time, German officers grasped the true danger. The Americans were not aiming to terrorize civilians. They were aiming to amputate the Reich's arteries of transport and industry. Still, in the officers' clubs and ready rooms, laughter continued. They were lucky, many insisted. A novelty raid. Next time we will show them the futility of daylight. That next time came with ferocity in 1943. The Americans, building strength, set their sights deeper, the industrial lungs of the Reich. No target was more vital, or more dangerous, than the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt assembly plants at Regensburg. August 17, 1943, exactly 1 year after Rouen. Hundreds of fortresses thundered into the sky, bound for twin objectives. The plan was ambitious, perhaps reckless. One wing would strike Regensburg, then fly onward to bases in North Africa, while the other would hammer Schweinfurt before returning to England. In theory, the Luftwaffe would be split between two distant battles. In practice, coordination faltered. Delays left the Schweinfurt force exposed, and the Germans pounced with fury. From the ground, civilians watched in awe and horror as silver phalanxes of bombers passed overhead, sunlight flashing off wings. Above them, tiny specks, fighters, dived and twisted, leaving white contrails like claw marks in the sky. 4 hours, the battles raged, machine gun chatter echoing across the heavens. The Luftwaffe claimed dozens of kills. Photographers captured flaming fortresses tumbling earthward, their tails shearing off, parachutes blossoming in desperate arcs. One German pilot wrote to his fiancée that evening, "It was like shooting down barns. They fall slowly, burning, groaning all the way." Yet the victories came at a price. Many German fighters returned with fuel tanks perforated, wings chewed by defensive fire, cockpits splattered with oil. And despite horrific losses, 60 bombers destroyed, hundreds of men killed or captured, the Americans did what they had promised. They delivered their payloads. At Regensburg, assembly halls for the Me-262 jet fighter burned for days. At Schweinfurt, the precision machine ball bearings, small, unglamorous, yet vital to every engine, every tank tread, every aircraft, were devastated. Production fell drastically. Even Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, admitted later, "It was the greatest crisis of the war industry. Without bearings, our machines would have ground to a halt." What haunted Luftwaffe officers was not just the destruction, but the psychology of the bombers. They did not turn back when losses mounted. They did not scatter like prey animals. Wounded fortresses, engines smoking, wings shredded, pressed onward as if bound by some mechanical willpower. In one notorious case, a B-17 nicknamed Knockout Dropper, limped home across the channel with its nose nearly severed, most of its crew dead or wounded. Yet it flew. A mechanic at a Luftwaffe base recalled standing on the runway, watching a crippled fortress pass overhead toward England. "We filled it with cannon shells. Half its tail was missing. We shouted for it to fall. It did not. It simply kept flying like some iron phantom." That day we realized, this was no ordinary enemy. Analytically, the reason was clear: redundancy. Each B-17 carried 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, any 2 of which could keep the bomber aloft. Fuel tanks were self-sealing, hydraulic systems duplicated. Armor plates shielded the cockpit and critical areas. To Germans used to brittle efficiency, the fortress was an insult to logic. Too heavy, too slow, yet perversely indestructible. And the formations, mathematical, unyielding, turned defensive fire into geometry. A squadron of fortresses could project nearly 400 interlocking streams of bullets, creating lethal volumes of space through which fighters had to pass. It was not elegant, but it was merciless. The laughter began to falter. In mess halls, pilots still joked about flying barns, but the jokes carried an edge, a nervousness. Losses among the Luftwaffe were mounting. Fuel was harder to replace, and so were trained pilots. Each attack on Regensburg or Schweinfurt drained not only factories but men, irreplaceable men, from Germany's dwindling reserves. I believe this was the turning point of perception. The Germans still told themselves they could win the air war. But deep down the question had changed. It was no longer, can we stop them? But, how long can we hold them off? The fortress, once a source of ridicule, had become a mirror, reflecting back the Reich's own fragility. If Schweinfurt and Regensburg revealed the tenacity of the flying fortress, then Hamburg revealed its true power, the ability not just to wound German industry, but to terrorize the Reich's very heart with precision fire. By mid-1943, Hamburg was more than a port city. It was Germany's shipbuilding hub, a spider at the center of naval production. U-boats slipped into the North Sea from its docks, shipyards hummed with laborers. The Luftwaffe had dismissed earlier raids by the RAF as disorganized bludgeons, damaging but imprecise. Yet when the fortresses arrived in force, accompanied by British bombers in a rare joint effort, the results were apocalyptic. The Americans struck by day, driving into walls of flak that shredded aluminum like paper. From the cockpits of B-17s, crews described the sky as black snow, bursts of shrapnel rattling against fuselages. Gunners fired blindly into contrails, sweat pouring despite the freezing altitude. Still the formations held. When their bomb bays opened, thousands of tons of explosives cascaded downward. Dockyards, oil refineries, and submarine pens vanished in fountains of smoke and flame. German workers, scrambling for cover, later recalled the sound as a giant tearing cloth, ripping the city in half. And then, at night, the RAF followed with incendiaries, igniting what became known as Operation Gamara, a firestorm that consumed tens of thousands of lives. The Luftwaffe's laughter had turned into silence. One pilot, grounding his Messerschmitt after hours of futile sorties, confessed, "We struck them, but they did not scatter. They came on like an iron tide. And behind them the city burned." From Hamburg, the fortresses pressed on to Bremen, another vital port and industrial complex. Shipyards, Focke-Wulf assembly lines, and steel plants were meticulously targeted. Crews spoke of the eerie precision. Norden bomb sites guiding payloads onto factories with uncanny accuracy. Though often exaggerated, the Norden gave Americans confidence to promise, "We can drop a bomb in a pickle barrel." Germans scoffed at the bravado, until they saw plants reduced to rubble, machines twisted like wire. Analytically, this precision was the fortress's true strategic weapon. While British night raids blanketed cities, the B-17s carved arteries out of Germany's war machine. Oil refineries at Bremen sputtered to ruin, ship production slowed, and the Luftwaffe itself began to feel shortages in replacement parts. Still, the Reich clung to bravado. Goebbels' propaganda spun tales of American losses, of fortresses falling like flies. Yet in private, reports circulated of factories destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Albert Speer himself noted in his memoirs, "Each raid erased months of labor. We repaired one hall only to see it flattened again." And then came Berlin. For Hitler, Berlin was not merely a city. It was the Reich's sacred core, untouchable, a symbol of invincibility. If enemy bombers could reach it, the myth collapsed. For the Americans, striking Berlin was not just strategy, it was a declaration. March 6, 1944. The 8th Air Force launched over 600 B-17s toward the German capital. Luftwaffe pilots scrambled in desperation, nearly 1,000 fighters converging. The air became a maelstrom of contrails, tracers, and explosions. From the ground, Berliners gazed upward, seeing sunlight glint off endless streams of silver wings. A civilian diarist wrote, "It was as if the sky itself had become American." For hours battles raged. Bombers fell in flames, parachutes scattered across fields, yet the fortresses pressed on. Over the capital, bomb bays opened, releasing steel rain onto factories, rail yards, and military installations. Hitler raged, but his rage could not smother the truth. Berlin had been breached. The psychological impact was shattering. Luftwaffe morale faltered. For the first time, many pilots admitted openly what they had whispered for months. They could not stop the tide. "We kill them by the dozens," one ace lamented, "but they arrive by the hundreds. We will drown in fortresses." What? The answer lay in numbers and in persistence. Unlike Germany, which strained to replace each aircraft, America's factories, Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, produced B-17s at a staggering rate. Over 12,000 would be built. For every fortress destroyed, another waited in line, engines humming. Technically too, the tide had shifted. By the time of the Berlin raids, P-51 Mustang escorts arrived, long-range fighters that bled the Luftwaffe dry. What began as duels against bombers now became slaughters, as Mustangs cut through Messerschmitts before they could close. The fortress no longer fought alone, it fought as the centerpiece of a machine of annihilation. Yet even before the escorts, the B-17 had carved its reputation. German pilots, once laughing at its bulk, now muttered of its durability with a mixture of awe and dread. They nicknamed it Wehrmotorige Unscheur, the four-engine monster. Some refused to engage head-on, knowing the risk of flying into converging streams of .50 caliber fire. Others confessed to nightmares, dreams of endless silver formations, engines roaring like drums of inevitability. Reporter accounts from Berlin describe civilians who once mocked the flying barns, now cowering as their windows rattled, as precise explosions consumed rail junctions and arms factories. The fortresses, one Berliner admitted, did not come for our spirits. They came for our bones. I believe this was the final stage of transformation. The fortress, once derided as clumsy, had become a legend of fear, not for elegance but for inevitability. It embodied America's industrial relentlessness, a steel echo of a nation that would not stop. From Hamburg's firestorms to Berlin's humiliation, the Luftwaffe's laughter had burned away, replaced by resignation. The hunters had become the hunted, and every airfield that once rang with mocking bets now shook under the thunder of American bombs. By the autumn of 1944, the sound of the flying fortress had become a grim drumbeat across Germany. No longer a novelty, no longer an insult to German pride, it was a daily reality, a steel shadow that stalked every city, every factory, every line of supply. The shift was unmistakable. Where once German pilots mocked the barns in the sky, they now prayed they would not be sent to intercept them. If Hamburg and Berlin had broken morale, the next phase broke capacity. The Americans understood that Germany's war machine ran on fuel, and fuel meant oil. Oil fields in Romania at Ploiești had been savaged by earlier raids, but by late 1944, the targets became refineries inside the Reich itself. Luna, Merseburg, Bolin. It was here that the fortress revealed its most merciless role, economic strangler. Day after day, box formations droned toward oil plants, escorted now by swarms of P-51 Mustangs. Flak towers bristled, fighters scrambled, but the formations could not be stopped. Refineries erupted in flames, columns of black smoke blotting out the sun. A German engineer at Luna later testified, "We repaired one cracking plant. The fortresses returned the next week and destroyed it again. We rebuilt. They returned." It was endless, like fighting the tide with a broom. Analytically, the strategy was simple: cut the Reich's veins. No fuel, no planes. No fuel, no tanks. By early 1945, Luftwaffe pilots often taxied to the runway only to find their tanks dry. The once proud squadrons of Messerschmitts stood idle, silent monuments to an air force starved to death from above. While oil bled away, the transport network suffered the same fate. Rail yards at Hamm, Cologne, Munich, all reduced to twisted wreckage. Precision bombing severed supply chains, leaving factories isolated, troops stranded. Even when trains ran, they moved under constant threat. Tracks were torn, bridges toppled, locomotives gutted by high explosives. It was not just destruction, it was paralysis. German commanders, used to rapid mobilization, found themselves shackled. Reinforcements delayed by days, sometimes weeks. Hitler raged, but rage could not move trains without rails. And then came Dresden. February 1945. Though remembered primarily for the RAF's incendiary raids, the B-17s of the 8th Air Force played their part in turning the Florence on the Elbe into a furnace. Dresden had been spared much of the war's destruction, a city of Baroque beauty and cultural pride. To the Germans it seemed untouchable, irrelevant to war. But its rail junctions, factories, and barracks told another story. When the fortresses appeared, locals ran into the streets in disbelief. "They will not bomb us," many insisted. But the bomb bays opened and steel rain fell. Rail yards vanished, bridges collapsed. Hours later, the RAF arrived with incendiaries and the city ignited. Survivors spoke of firestorms sucking oxygen from the air, of people collapsing in cellars as flames devoured everything above. For the Luftwaffe, Dresden was a symbol of futility. They had no fuel to scramble significant defense, no strength to contest the sky. German pilots, grounded, listened helplessly as their radios filled with reports. Dresden is burning. From an analyst's view, Dresden was not about military necessity alone, it was about demonstration. A fortress city reduced to ashes showed what awaited every corner of the Reich. It was the crescendo of an orchestra that had begun at Rouen, played through Schweinfurt, and now thundered at the gates of Germany's collapse. By spring 1945, the transformation was absolute. Luftwaffe morale had not merely cracked, it had disintegrated. New pilots, hastily trained, were thrown into battles they could not survive. Many had fewer than 20 hours of flight time when they faced squadrons of fortresses escorted by seasoned Mustang aces. They died in droves. The veterans who remained spoke openly of futility. One officer recorded in his diary, "We do not fight for victory now. We fight to delay the inevitable." The fortresses are not planes, they are executioners. Technically, the imbalance was staggering. By 1945, the 8th Air Force could send more than 1,000 bombers in a single raid. Each fortress carried up to 4,800 pounds of bombs. Multiply that by hundreds, and the arithmetic became apocalyptic. Germany, once the master of blitzkrieg, was itself blitzed into rubble. Factories lay silent. Synthetic oil production collapsed to 10% of capacity. Rail yards remained choked with wreckage. Even communication centers, telephone exchanges, and bridges were erased. The Reich's arteries were cut, its lungs punctured. And perhaps most decisive of all, the myth of Luftwaffe superiority was gone. Once, German pilots had toasted each other with schnapps, betting how many barns they would shoot down. Now they avoided eye contact, haunted by the sight of endless silver formations. Some admitted privately to trembling when the sound of engines filled the sky, a sound that once promised prey, now promised doom. A mechanic in Munich, interviewed after the war, recalled, "We laughed at the flying fortress. We thought it clumsy, stupid. But in the end it was we who were clumsy. We fought with pride, and pride is brittle. The fortress fought with steel, and steel endured." I believe this captures the essence of the B-17 story. It was never the fastest, never the sleekest. Yet its endurance, its precision, its sheer relentlessness turned German laughter into silence, then silence into fear, and finally fear into collapse. By May 1945, the roar of the fortress engines was no longer a daily torment. The war was over. Germany lay in ruins. And those who once mocked the flying barns stood amid the rubble, realizing too late that the barns had carried the fire that destroyed an empire. The spring of 1945 was unlike any season Germany had ever known. The birds of spring no longer sang alone. The roar of engines drowned them out, engines that came not in pairs or dozens but in thousands. The flying fortress, once dismissed as lumbering prey, now filled the skies with an inevitability that even the most stubborn German officer could not deny. By now the Reich was a skeleton. Its factories gutted, its refineries silent, its rail lines shattered. Yet the fortresses kept coming. Some questioned why, what was left to destroy. But the answer was simple: momentum. The Americans understood that the war could not end until every artery of the German machine had been cauterized. Day after day, formations darkened the sky. Towns that had never before seen war felt it in their bones as the ground shook beneath high explosive impacts. Bridges already rebuilt after previous raids were flattened again. Marshalling yards were struck twice in a week. The precision was merciless. Where the RAF had blanketed cities by night, the B-17s dissected them by day, cutting out organs one by one. Luftwaffe pilots who still took to the air did so in desperation. Many had fewer than 10 hours of combat training. They climbed into cockpits knowing their chances of survival were slimmer than a coin toss. One young recruit confessed in his last letter, "We are sent to die like moths against fire. The fortresses are not machines, they are storms." The veterans fared little better. Once proud aces with dozens of kills, now found themselves overwhelmed not by skill but by sheer mathematics. Against a wall of machine gun fire and swarms of P-51 escorts, even the most seasoned pilot could be erased in seconds. Some refused to engage head-on, circling helplessly as the bombers rumbled past. Others tried suicide dives, clawing for a chance to break the formations, only to be torn apart before reaching their targets. By 1945, Luftwaffe losses had become catastrophic. In January alone, hundreds of fighters were destroyed, many before they could even take off. Fuel shortages meant planes sat idle, cannibalized for parts. The once proud airfields where laughter and bets had echoed, now stood silent, their hangars bombed out husks. American crews too carried scars. The fortress was tough, but it was not invincible. Thousands of airmen never returned, their names etched into memorials across England and America. Survivors spoke of watching friends vanish in fireballs, of limping home with holes so large the wind howled through the fuselage. Yet they flew again the next day, driven by duty, by the conviction that each raid shortened the war. A waist gunner named James Doyle remembered the moment he realized the fortress was not just a machine but a lifeline. We took flak over Cologne. Shrapnel tore through the floor, killed our radio man. Both port engines gone. But she held us. I could feel her fighting to stay in the air, as if the plane itself refused to die. When we landed in England, the ground crew counted over 200 holes. They said she should not have flown. But she did. On the other side, German civilians experienced a different memory. Diaries from Berlin, Leipzig, Nuremberg describe the same ritual. The distant hum, growing into a roar, then the whistle of falling bombs, the ground erupting. Children clutched mothers and cellars. Workers prayed among rubble. For them, the fortress was no longer a curiosity, it was apocalypse delivered on 4 engines. Strategically, the final blows were decisive. By targeting synthetic oil plants and transportation hubs, the fortresses ensured that Germany could not move men or fuel tanks. By February 1945, jet fighters like the Me-262, potential game-changers, sat on runways without kerosene. Tanks stood abandoned for lack of diesel. Even panzer divisions that reached the front lines stalled, starving for supplies that railways could no longer deliver. In March, the Rhine was crossed. American and British troops surged into Germany, supported overhead by the same bombers that had pounded the Reich for years. Luftwaffe resistance was negligible. The hunters of 1940 had become ghosts by 1945. And then, silence. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The laughter that had once filled Luftwaffe mess halls was gone, buried beneath rubble and silence. Survivors spoke bitterly of their arrogance. A mechanic in Leipzig recalled, "We called them flying barns. We joked they could not fight. In the end, it was we who could not fight. We had no fuel, no machines, no sky." For the Americans, the fortress became more than a bomber, it became a symbol. Newspapers called it the plane that won the war. Hollywood filmed its missions. Veterans told stories that bordered on myth. Planes flying home with tails severed, wings aflame, crews alive because the fortress refused to die. Technically, historians still debate. The B-17 was not the most efficient bomber. Its cousin, the B-24 Liberator, carried heavier loads and the later B-29 outclassed both. But the fortress carried something intangible: reputation. Its silhouette struck fear. Its persistence broke morale. Its name, Flying Fortress, was no longer a joke but a truth written in fire and steel. I believe the story of the B-17 is not just about bombs or battles. It is about perception. The Germans mocked it because they could not imagine a machine so inelegant could be so effective. They laughed, and in their laughter they revealed their blindness. The fortress endured because it did not need to be sleek or fast or beautiful. It only needed to be relentless. And relentless it was, until the war itself was ground into ash. In the early 1940s, when the Flying Fortress first appeared in European skies, even Allied pilots whispered doubts. The B-17 was massive. A wingspan stretching nearly 31 meters, its frame bloated compared to the sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that prowled the skies. It lumbered forward at a cruising speed of just over 160 miles per hour, hardly faster than some civilian planes of the interwar years. To the Luftwaffe, this was not a predator. It was prey. From the ground, civilians saw the formations crawling across the heavens like silver insects, so slow that one could count the seconds between their passing. German aces laughed openly. A flying barn, they called it. Others joked it was a whale trying to dance among sharks. Compared to the darting fighters of the day, the fortress seemed absurd, too large, too sluggish, too obvious. And in a sense, the laughter had logic. Air combat doctrine of the time prized speed, maneuverability, surprise. By those standards, the B-17 was a violation of every principle. It was easy to spot, easy to target, impossible to hide. To dive upon one in a Messerschmitt seemed as natural as hawks diving on doves. Yet reality has a way of punishing overconfidence. The first time German pilots met fortresses in formation, the joke began to unravel. Approaches that had worked against British bombers failed. Diving from above meant crossing the arcs of interlocking top and nose guns. Swinging in from behind meant flying directly into the twin streams of tail gunners and dorsal turrets. Even side attacks were perilous. 4 waist gunners stood ready with twin .50 caliber Brownings. The geometry was brutal. A squadron of 12 fortresses could project nearly 500 rounds per second in defensive fire. A group of 50 turned the sky into a web of lead. What had looked like slow prey was, in truth, a moving fortress, each bomber covering the blind spots of its neighbors, each gunner part of a synchronized shield. And then came the endurance. German pilots often described the shock of watching B-17s soak up punishment that would have destroyed any Luftwaffe fighter. Cannon shells tore through wings, shredded control surfaces, set engines ablaze, and still the fortresses flew. One crewman remembered a bomber returning to base with its nose nearly severed, held together only by structural spars, the bombardier crawling back through a gap where daylight streamed in. Another limped across the channel with half its tail missing. Crew braced for a plunge that never came. A Luftwaffe mechanic admitted later, "We riddled them with shells. Sometimes we put 20-30 rounds into one, and still it would not fall. We thought it witchcraft." The explanation was not sorcery but engineering. Designers had built redundancy into every nerve of the machine. 4 engines meant 2 could fail and the bomber would still fly. Control cables were doubled, hydraulic systems mirrored. Armor plates shielded the cockpit and fuel tanks. Self-sealing linings reduced fire. The fortress had not been built to dance, it had been built to endure. This endurance turned the initial German laughter into frustration. Pilots returned to base with ammunition spent, claiming hits on multiple bombers, yet reporting few confirmed kills. Worse, the fortresses, even smoking and limping, still reached their targets. Factories burned, rail yards collapsed, oil plants erupted. The joke had become a nightmare, a machine that refused to die until its mission was complete. Even the American crews, who cursed the cramped quarters and deafening engines, grew to trust the fortress as more than steel. To them it was a companion, almost alive. Waist gunners gave nicknames to their planes: Memphis Belle, 909, Shoo Shoo Baby. They spoke of their fortresses as if of comrades, praising how she brought us home, even when blood stained the floor and holes gaped in the fuselage. And so the paradox was revealed. Yes, the B-17 was slow, bulky, and obvious. Yes, it invited attack. But it turned those very weaknesses into bait, drawing the Luftwaffe into meat grinder battles that drained their pilots and machines. By the time Germans realized the trap, it was too late. Their fuel dwindled, their factories smoldered, their aces dead or captured. I believe this is why the laughter of 1942 is remembered with such irony. It was not wrong to mock the fortress on paper. By theory it broke all the rules. But wars are not fought on paper. Wars are fought in smoke and steel, and in that reality the fortress was no barn, it was a citadel of the skies. By 1945, the joke had inverted. German civilians, once scoffing at the ungainly shapes overhead, now whispered in fear when they heard the drone of engines. Pilots who once bet schnapps on kills now avoided eye contact, dreading their next sortie. The flying barn had become the monster that haunted their final nights. To understand why German pilots moved from laughter to fear, one must look under the skin of the flying fortress. Numbers and steel, when read together, tell a story more persuasive than any diary. At first glance, the fortress was an ungainly brute. Empty weight, over 32,000 pounds. Fully loaded, nearly 55,000. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engines hung like muscular shoulders on its wings, each pushing 1,200 horsepower. Compare this to the Messerschmitt Bf-109, the Luftwaffe's workhorse. A single Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, producing 1,475 horsepower. The German fighter, half the size and weight, could sprint at over 380 miles per hour. The B-17, in contrast, struggled to reach 290 at best altitude. On paper, the German pilot's mockery made sense. Imagine a cheetah circling an ox. Speed, agility, elegance, all favored the Luftwaffe. A dive from above, cannons blazing, seemed destined to rip apart such a slow target. And in fact, a lone fortress in open sky was meat for the Hawks. But the fortress was never designed to fight alone. Its doctrine was formation, and its formation was geometry incarnate. Each B-17 bristled with up to 13.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each with a rate of fire over 800 rounds per minute. Nose, chin, tail, top, belly and waist, 360 degrees of overlapping arcs. Picture 12 of these behemoths flying in a box. From any approach, a German fighter would be caught in a cone of fire. Dive from the rear? The tail gunner and dorsal turret stitch the sky. Slide from the side? Waist gunners and top turret rake across. From below? The ball turret spins upward like a deadly glass bubble, spraying 50 caliber streams. A single fortress could be deadly, a dozen were a fortress wall. German fighters relied heavily on the MG-150-120, a 20mm autocannon. Each round could punch through armor and detonate inside. A burst of 3 or 4 was enough to shatter most Allied fighters. Yet against B-17 things were different. The fortress carried armor plate around its cockpit and vital systems, and its structure was layered with redundancy. Fuel tanks were self-sealing, designed to swell and close when punctured. Hydraulic lines were duplicated, meaning a single break did not cripple controls. This is why Luftwaffe pilots described their disbelief. They poured cannon shells into bombers, 10, 20, sometimes 30 hits. Against a Spitfire that would mean flaming wreckage. Against a fortress it meant smoke, fire but still flight. German ground crews sometimes cheered, expecting a mortally wounded bomber to spiral down, only to watch it crawl stubbornly westward, dropping bombs along the way, vanishing into the Channel mist. From the analyst's view, this was the paradox. The fortress sacrificed speed for resilience. It gave up agility for armor. In the age of dogfights it broke the rules. And yet, in breaking them it changed the game. The Luftwaffe adapted, of course. Tactics shifted from solo dives to coordinated group attacks. Dozens of fighters massed on one formation, hoping sheer volume of fire could overwhelm. Heavy fighters like the Focke-Wulf FW-190A were armed with 20mm cannons and even 30 million Malawian Quachas 108s, designed to crack open bombers with fewer hits. But coordination required time, and time was a luxury against waves of hundreds of fortresses. And the B-17 was not entirely passive. Gunners claimed kills with growing confidence. In 1943 alone, American records listed thousands of Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed by defensive fire. The exact numbers remain debated, but Luftwaffe records confirm hundreds of fighters lost to bomber guns. One German ace complained, attacking a box of fortresses was suicide. One could expect a storm of bullets before even pulling the trigger. The Germans laughed at its slowness. Yet that very slowness gave stability. The Norden bomb sight, fitted into the nose, required steady flight to calculate trajectories. At 25,000 feet, a fortress could open its bays and drop bombs with accuracy that stunned even the enemy. While not every mission hit a pickle barrel, the consistency of damage to refineries, rail yards, and factories testified to a machine whose bulk had purpose. Thus, every number told a story. 4 engines against 1. 13 guns against 2 or 4. 30 tons of resilience against 2 tons of speed. On paper, the cheetah still seems superior. But in practice, the ox carried armor, horns, and the will to trample. By late 1943, the duel between Fortress and Luftwaffe had become less about individual planes and more about systems. The Germans possessed fighters that, on paper, could annihilate bombers. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G was lighter, faster, with a climb rate that dwarfed the lumbering Fortress. The Focke-Wulf FW-190A, with its 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns, could shred a single bomber in seconds. And by 1944 the Luftwaffe even fielded specialized Sturmgruppen, armored FW-190s designed to dive headlong into formations, their armor shielding them from defensive fire. Yet against the Fortress none of this was enough. The reason lay in endurance and numbers. A fortress could absorb punishment because it was designed not as a sprinter, but as a survivor. Consider fuel systems. German fighters carried only a few hundred liters, enough for an hour or so of combat before returning to base. A B-17 carried over 1,700 gallons, spread across multiple tanks. Even if one was punctured, self-sealing linings minimized leaks. Pilots often described fuel streaming from wings, igniting in flames, yet engines still roared, enough to keep the machine airborne. Engines themselves were another paradox. A Messerschmitt had one, sleek and powerful, but a single hit often meant instant death. The Fortress had four. Lose one, it kept going. Lose two, still airborne. There are records of Fortresses limping back across the channel on a single sputtering cyclone, crew praying, fuselage torn open, yet wheels touching English soil all the same. German pilots began to notice this disparity with dread. In reports, phrases like unfallbar appeared. They shot, they hit, but still the giants lumbered onward, dropping their payloads. And then came firepower. The Luftwaffe's 20mm MG-150-120 cannon shells could rip through fighters with ease. But against the thick ribs of the Fortress, many rounds simply punched holes without detonating in critical areas. The 30mm Malawian Quach's 108 was more effective, its explosive shells devastating in a few hits. Yet the 108 Malawian Quachas had low velocity, forcing pilots to close dangerously near. And to approach meant entering the storm. 50 caliber tracers streaking from every angle, a kaleidoscope of death. Survivor accounts illustrate this clash vividly. A Luftwaffe ace recalled diving at a formation, aiming his Mk-108s, only to see his comrades' planes explode beside him, shredded before they fired. He pulled away shaken, muttering, "It is like flying into a wall of daggers." For American crews, the numbers told another story. Each gunner carried thousands of rounds. At maximum, a Fortress group could unleash more than 50,000 bullets in a single engagement. Even if most missed, the statistical certainty of hits was high. Luftwaffe pilots understood this grim arithmetic. Every second spent in range multiplied the chance of death. And yet, the Fortress was not invulnerable. Losses were staggering in 1943, especially before long-range escorts arrived. Entire groups were cut down over Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Gunners fought desperately and still formations melted in flames. But here was the paradox again. Even mauled, even bled, the Fortresses completed missions. Factories were bombed, railways severed, oil plants torched. Germany bled faster than America. The comparison becomes stark when viewed as a duel of resources. A single B-17 took thousands of man-hours to build, but American factories produced them by the hundreds each month. The Luftwaffe could not replace pilots at the same rate. An ace lost in 1944 was gone forever. A Fortress lost was replaced by the next convoy from Seattle. Thus, technical details translated into strategy. 4 engines against 1 meant survival after hits. Armor plate against light frames meant endurance. 13 guns against 2 meant deterrence. Precision bomb sight against guesswork meant results. Together, these made the Fortress more than the sum of its parts. It was not elegant. It was not fast. But it was inevitable. By 1944, even hardened German commanders admitted this truth. General Adolf Galland, head of Fighter Command, described the bomber formations as steel walls, impossible to breach without terrible sacrifice. Luftwaffe pilots, once laughing at the barns, now dreaded the sound of their engines. The Fortress had turned its supposed weaknesses into strengths. Its bulk became resilience. Its slowness became stability. Its vulnerability became bait that drained Germany dry. And so the technical story became human. German laughter transforming into silence, then into fear. The story of the B-17 is not merely one of steel and gunpowder, it is also a story of perception, of how an enemy's assumptions can become its undoing. The Luftwaffe's mockery of the Flying Fortress was not baseless. It arose from comparisons that, at first glance, seemed irrefutable. Line up the aircraft side by side. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 versus the B-17. One weighed barely 3 tons, the other nearly 30. One could accelerate to over 380 miles per hour, the other plodded along at under 300. One danced with nimble agility, the other lumbered like a marching column. To German pilots trained in the gospel of speed and maneuver, the Fortress looked like a caricature. And for solitary encounters, the comparison held. A lone B-17 against a determined fighter stood little chance. Its gunners could fire, but angles were limited, blind spots real. Luftwaffe instructors reassured recruits, approach correctly and the Fortress falls. But war is rarely about single duels. The Americans did not send bombers alone. They sent them in phalanxes, overlapping fields of fire, formations that turned disadvantages into advantages. Where the Messerschmitt's speed allowed it to dart in, it also forced it to exit quickly, or else be shredded by the defensive crossfire. Where the fortress's bulk made it a target, it also allowed it to absorb punishment and continue. Here lay the first German miscalculation. Assuming tactical superiority guaranteed strategic success. In 1943, Luftwaffe High Command believed concentrated attacks could destroy bomber groups before they reached their targets. Indeed, Schweinfurt and Regensburg seemed to confirm this. Dozens of fortresses shot down, American losses horrific. But the Americans kept coming. Unlike Germany, America could replace losses faster than they were inflicted. A fortress lost was a tragedy, a dozen lost a setback. But 100 new planes arrived the next month. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, bled irreplaceable assets, pilots. Every raid cost them not just machines but men trained through years of combat. A German ace might down 5 bombers in a day, but if he failed to return fire, Germany lost experience it could not replace. The Americans, in effect, traded steel for blood, and in a war of attrition, it was Germany's blood that ran out first. The second miscalculation lay in technology. The Luftwaffe expected their cannons to dominate. The MG 150-120, firing 20mm rounds, was lethal against fighters. The 108 Malawian Quachas, with its 30mm shells, could tear a bomber apart with 3 or 4 hits. But they underestimated the fortress's redundancy. Hits that would destroy a Spitfire merely wounded a B-17. Even smoking, even trailing fuel, bombers pressed on. Reports piled in of aircraft dropping payloads despite catastrophic damage, then limping home. German disbelief grew, but disbelief did not stop the bombs. The third miscalculation was psychological. By laughing at the fortress, Luftwaffe officers cultivated arrogance. They told themselves that Americans were amateurs, incapable of true precision warfare. When bombs began to fall not on cities at random but on ball-bearing plants, oil refineries and rail yards, the laughter curdled. Each destroyed factory was not just rubble. It was time stolen from the Reich, machines silenced, tanks unfueled. Meanwhile, the Americans exploited the very weaknesses the Germans identified. The fortress was slow, yes, but its steadiness enabled the Norden bombsight to achieve remarkable accuracy. The fortress was heavy, yes, but its armor and structure meant survival. The fortress was visible, yes, but that visibility drew Luftwaffe fighters into battles that drained their strength. Perhaps the most fatal German mistake was believing in short wars. The Luftwaffe had been built for blitzkrieg, fast, decisive campaigns. Their aircraft were optimized for tactical dominance, not long attritional battles. The Americans, by contrast, waged war by weight. They accepted losses in exchange for persistence. The fortress was the embodiment of this philosophy, not perfect, not invulnerable, but relentless. By 1944, with P-51 escorts sweeping the skies, the comparison was over. German fighters, once the hawks, had become pigeons hunted in their own skies. Fortress groups now traveled under protective umbrellas, their gunners free to pour fire without fear of sudden swarms. What had once seemed laughable had become untouchable. The irony is striking. The Luftwaffe was correct in its technical critique. The B-17 was slow, clumsy, obvious. But their error lay in underestimating what those flaws concealed: resilience, precision, and industrial backing. They saw an easy target. They failed to see an inexhaustible tide. I believe this is the true lesson of the fortress. Wars are not won by perfect machines, but by machines that can endure, repeat, and accumulate effect. The Luftwaffe gambled on brilliance. The Americans invested in inevitability. And inevitability won. As the propellers of the B-17 continued to slice through the European skies, the consequences of the Luftwaffe's strategic miscalculations began to manifest. This was no longer a matter of theoretical tactics or pilot training exercises. It became a tangible reality of material loss, human attrition, and psychological strain that reverberated across the air war. Every German pilot shot down represented more than a lost aircraft. It was years of combat-honed skill erased. While American crews, trained to operate in coordinated formations, could be replaced through systematic training and industrial support, Luftwaffe expertise was finite. Losing an ace was not just a numerical loss. It weakened tactical cohesion and eroded the institutional memory of air combat. By mid-1943, experienced Luftwaffe units were being increasingly replaced by younger, less seasoned pilots who faced veteran fortress crews armed with disciplined gunners and precise bombing techniques. Over time, this imbalance contributed to escalating German casualties and declining operational effectiveness in every engagement. The relentless bombing campaigns forced Germany into a reactive posture. Factories, rail lines, oil refineries, and ball-bearing plants were prime targets. Every strike not only destroyed immediate output but imposed a ripple effect, slowing war production, stretching supply chains, and diverting labor into repairs instead of innovation or expansion. The Reich was trapped in a costly cycle: rebuild, protect, and rebuild again. Meanwhile, the American industrial machine, unshaken by attrition, could churn out dozens of B-17s each month. The fortress became the embodiment of a war of endurance, trading individual losses for cumulative effect. German planners had assumed tactical victories would translate into strategic dominance, but the sustained output of the Allies rendered those assumptions futile. In essence, Germany fought a war of attrition it was structurally ill-prepared to win. The early mocking of the B-17 by Luftwaffe officers reflected overconfidence that proved fatal. When the bombs began systematically destroying German infrastructure rather than scattering harmlessly, the laughter turned to disbelief. Factories once considered untouchable were leveled. Supply depots meant to support armored divisions were reduced to rubble. The cumulative effect was psychological. Officers and pilots who had been trained to expect quick, decisive victories now faced a grinding, unrelenting enemy. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's morale was strained not just by physical losses but by the realization that their technical brilliance was being overwhelmed by sheer persistence and industrial capacity. Each fortress that survived returned fire and completed its mission served as a tangible demonstration of American resilience, and a constant reminder of German vulnerability. The insistence on short war doctrines and rapid tactical supremacy became a liability. Luftwaffe aircraft, optimized for agility and blitzkrieg-style operations, were ill-suited for prolonged, attritional combat against large bomber formations. Every failed interception forced re-evaluation, yet structural limitations prevented meaningful adaptation. By the time long-range escorts like the P-51 Mustang appeared, the Luftwaffe faced an enemy not only better equipped but better organized for persistence. Fortress formations could now fly under protective coverage, and the crossfire that once promised vulnerability had become a lethal shield. German fighters, once the dominant predators of European airspace, were gradually relegated to defensive roles, hunted by aircraft they had once easily outmaneuvered. The B-17's apparent flaws, slowness, bulk, and visibility, became instruments of strategic advantage, highlighting the contrast between German tactical rigidity and American technological adaptation. The Norden bomb sight allowed precision strikes, turning the fortress's weight and steadiness into an asset. Armor and redundancy enabled survival under intense fire, and the collective firepower of formations created zones of mutual protection. The Germans, by adhering to assumptions about what constituted an easy target, failed to anticipate how these characteristics could be leveraged to multiply effectiveness. In this sense, the long-term impact was as much doctrinal as material. The Luftwaffe's inability to reinterpret tactics in response to industrial-scale bombing fundamentally shaped the outcome of the air war over Europe. Over time, the consequences extended beyond immediate battles. The destruction of transportation networks slowed troop and equipment movement, making defensive operations less flexible. Energy shortages, particularly from bombed refineries, reduced the operational range of tanks, aircraft, and mechanized units. The Luftwaffe's attrition in pilots and aircraft forced reliance on less experienced units, which in turn increased losses during late-war engagements such as the Battle of the Bulge. The American bombing campaign, anchored by the B-17, became not just a tactical effort but a strategic lever, reshaping the broader operational environment in favor of the Allies. The fortress was, in effect, a tool of systemic disruption, precise, durable, and persistent. The long-term influence of the B-17 campaign extended beyond World War II. It demonstrated that technological superiority alone does not guarantee victory. Operational doctrine, industrial capacity, and psychological endurance are equally decisive. The Luftwaffe's failures underscored the risks of over-reliance on early war assumptions, while American persistence illustrated the power of integrating strategy, technology, and production into a coherent, resilient framework. The legacy of these lessons informed post-war doctrines across multiple air forces, emphasizing massed formation operations, strategic bombing campaigns, and the necessity of industrial and logistical depth. By 1945, the air war over Europe had crystallized a paradox. The fortress, mocked for its flaws, had become a vector of inevitability. German miscalculations in assessment, strategy, and psychology allowed the Americans to convert a seemingly vulnerable platform into a decisive instrument of war. The consequences of these miscalculations were both immediate, losses in men and material, and enduring, shaping not only the outcome of the European conflict but the post-war understanding of air power and industrialized warfare. In sum, the B-17 campaign exemplified a transformation from tactical vulnerability to strategic dominance. The Luftwaffe's early derision, grounded in plausible technical critiques, failed to account for the multiplier effect of endurance, organization, and production capacity. The long-term consequences were catastrophic for Germany. Material destruction, attritional loss of experienced personnel, diminished morale, and ultimately strategic impotence. Meanwhile, the United States demonstrated the efficacy of sustained, coordinated, and resource-backed air operations, a blueprint that would influence military thought for decades. The story of the Flying Fortress was not only one of aircraft and bullets, but of foresight, resilience, and the inexorable power of systematic planning. German pilots had once laughed at the B-17 Flying Fortress, dismissing it as slow, lumbering, and an easy mark for anyone with wings and trigger fingers. They imagined their Messerschmitts could dart in, strike, and leave with barely a scratch. Yet as the bombing campaigns pressed deeper into Germany, that laughter turned to disbelief, then to horror. The fortresses, relentless and seemingly indestructible, tore through the fabric of the Reich's defenses, systematically targeting airfields, supply depots, and military installations. Every mission was a calculated blow, every formation a testament to coordination and endurance, and soon the very bases that had launched those cocky German pilots were reduced to rubble. Fuel depots, hangars, and training grounds vanished beneath the explosions, leaving pilots stranded, mechanics idle, and command structures struggling to keep pace. The irony was stark. The aircraft they had once mocked had not only survived their best attacks but had returned again and again, each time inflicting greater damage. American planners understood the power of attrition at a scale the Luftwaffe had never anticipated, and the B-17 became the ultimate instrument of that strategy. As viewers watch this video, you'll see just how a plane once underestimated could reshape the skies and devastate entire military infrastructures. A story that proves persistence and preparation can outweigh raw agility or initial superiority. The destruction of Germany's air bases was not instantaneous but cumulative. Each sortie weakened the Luftwaffe, each returned fortress carried both the psychological weight of invulnerability and the physical evidence of industrial and tactical resilience. German pilots faced the cruel reality that their earlier assumptions were catastrophically flawed. They were trained for blitzkrieg, for decisive tactical engagements, not for an enduring storm that came in waves of steel and precision. Yet the Americans, with factories humming and crews drilled to exacting standards, turned the supposed weaknesses of the B-17 into tools of power. Its bulk allowed the Norden bombsight to work with deadly accuracy, its armor absorbed punishment that would have grounded lighter aircraft, and its defensive guns created zones of mutual protection that could shred attacking fighters. In the skies over Germany, the hunters became the hunted. The fortress did more than destroy targets. It dismantled morale, disrupted logistics, and forced an entire military structure into retreat. Every destroyed base meant fewer sorties, less fuel, and less training for German pilots, compounding losses that Germany could not replace. And yet, the story of the B-17 is not just history, it's a lesson in strategy, resilience, and the unexpected power of endurance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the untold story of the Flying Fortress, make sure to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you won't miss the next episode, where we explore how this relentless air campaign directly influenced the final months of the war. The B-17 proved that perception alone cannot win a war. Underestimating an enemy's capacity to adapt and persist can turn derision into disaster. By the end of the European campaign, German pilots could only acknowledge what their laughter had denied them. The Flying Fortress had become a force that could, and did, destroy entire military bases, reshape the battlefield, and redefine what it meant to wage war from the skies. And as you watch the bomber soar across this video, Remember that this is more than metal and bullets. It is a story of inevitability, preparation, and the cumulative impact of strategy executed with relentless precision. Subscribe now to our channel to uncover more stories of air warfare that defied expectation and changed history forever, because the lessons of the Flying Fortress still resonate today, proving that persistence, planning, and industrial might can triumph over raw talent and early assumptions.